This podcast is brought to you by Alsbrook Accounting. Alsbrook Accounting is Rochester's entrepreneurial financial service provider. Their local team provides experienced accounting, bookkeeping, tax prep, and advising at extremely affordable rates to help entrepreneurs and businesses of all sizes launch smart and grow fast. Contact Alsbrook Accounting today at 931-841-4937 or www.alsbrookaccounting.com. That's ALSBROOK accounting.com for a free consultation to get your business off the ground and on track for growth. I'm Amanda Leitner, and welcome to Rochester Rising, where I amplify the stories of Rochester entrepreneurs. Welcome to episode 143 of the podcast today. So today we share our latest From the Edge series within this podcast, talking trends in entrepreneurship. So today we're joined by special guest Matt Smyth. Matt is a corporate and patent attorney with Headland Law here in Rochester, and we're also joined, as always, by Jamie Sundsbak, Community Manager of Collider Coworking. So we have a really great conversation in store for you today, talking about multiple trends in entrepreneurship, some of the same that keep coming up again and again, which shows their importance. But today we talk about the sharing economy and the sustainability of these platforms, such as Airbnb and Lyft. We talk about trends towards slower and more steady business growth, changing office environments, the reality of remote teams, and how to facilitate smooth communication with remote teams. We talk about keys to successful working groups and the importance for physical proximity of working relationships and collaboration. So you're in for a treat today. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this conversation with Matt Smyth, Jamie Sundsbak, and myself. Thanks for being here for our latest From the Edge podcast, talking trends in entrepreneurship. So I'll let our guests introduce themselves.
I'm Matt Smyth, corporate and patent attorney here in Rochester.
I'm Jamie Sundsbak from Collider Coworking. I think I'm always here.
Yeah, so like I said, we're here talking trends in entrepreneurship, whether on the local level or on a national level. And yeah, we'll let you kick us off, Matt, with what you want to talk about today.
Well, thank you. It's been a great to be a part of the ecosystem here at Collider and Collider 424. And it's been great over the last year after I hung out my own shingle to get to know folks in the Rochester area and see some of these trends that I think we're seeing on a national scale quite directly with folks in town and clients and outside of Rochester as well. So maybe just a couple trends that I think a lot of folks are talking about nationally, and that certainly we all have seen here in Rochester. I'll just throw out a couple, and we can talk about some of these. So one, of course, a sharing economy has really taken off, and we've all heard about Airbnb and Lyft, and numerous studies have been done on that business model, that kind of business model. Certainly, entrepreneurs are picking up on that and continuing to develop businesses around that, and I think there's some strategic points and implications to that kind of model. So that's maybe one trend, and maybe if you'd like, I'll just go through a list of maybe 4 of these, and we can take it from there. So secondly, whereas in the past, there are certainly the blockbuster entrepreneurial examples and showcases have been companies that have had really explosive growth or explosive starts, and I think there's certainly a trend emphasizing more of a slower, steadier revenue growth approach. Third trend is, notwithstanding that point, certainly there still is a lot of attention and a lot of investment money that is going to disruptive innovation when that is available, and niche markets. And then fourth, as we've seen, the office environment continuing to evolve. There are lots of changes there, and I think that's hit the entrepreneurial community, and I think in many cases the entrepreneurial community has taken advantage of some of the changes there as more folks are working remotely, as there are more opportunities to provide freelancing work, sort of on-demand solutions. And many entrepreneurs are taking advantage of that to build a business on the side while they're doing one or more other things with their time. So just a handful of trends certainly that are getting national attention, and that I think we've all seen aspects here in Rochester and in Minnesota.
I feel like I need to phone a friend for the option of what to talk about first, but we won't do that. So I guess the first topic you brought up that is really interesting to me is this sort of Lyft, Airbnb world, and I'm a little bit of a follower of the stock market, and I start to really dig into some of these once they go public. And what astounds me is, are any of these companies profitable? I don't know. It seems a little bit crazy that, I understand why things go public. I understand the venture capital process, but I sometimes worry that some of this stuff isn't sustainable over the long run.
Because I don't think Bird's profitable, is it?
I don't think so.
I don't think it is at all. And
I think Airbnb claimed they were profitable last quarter, but I don't know if the numbers really bore that out. I'm just curious because what we're doing is we're building platforms that people can jump in and work and make some money. But at the end of the day, unless those platforms are really generating revenue, I don't know how they're sustainable in the long run. And so that's just me being an old man and kind of saying I've always, as I've talked to people in the community about starting a business, everybody's shooting for that. In fact, I don't know how many times I've heard in this very room, I'm the Uber of fill in the blank.
Yeah.
And to me, my response is always like, why would you want to be that? So it's just, I think too often people sort of go after these sort of, I would say sort of riffs of things that are popular, and they really don't think very hard about how they can be generating revenue on day one. And that's something that I think in the Midwest we're doing a better job of, or at least I'm seeing it more than what you'd see typically in Silicon Valley and stuff like that. But it's just always something that's been on my mind. It's like, are we building companies the right way because we're building them to scale rapidly, but there's really not much behind it? Or is it better to build a company that's small, that's slow growth, but that has revenue from day one? So those are my crazy observations.
Great points. And I think on a national scale, a couple of these examples, obviously everybody looks at Airbnb and Lyft and Uber, and on the national scale, perhaps some of these huge examples get a little bit more grace from investors just because of the enormous scale that they have globally. But certainly there is carryover to the entrepreneurial community and folks who are looking to offer some kind of a service with a sharing model. And I think you're exactly right that there's sometimes a lack of attention given to how do you get to revenue, or how do you get to revenue quickly, especially given that revenue for any business oftentimes takes far longer to get to and requires hurdling far more obstacles than many entrepreneurs anticipate going into it.
Yeah, we think it's kind of an interesting business model when you're working in the sharing economy, and depending on whatever you call it, lime juicers, Lyft drivers, I always wonder what the profit sharing is to them, and I don't think it's quite what everyone thinks. Like when you do a DoorDash, that X percentage is, or the tip is going to the driver, and it's not, is my understanding. So, if you don't treat those contractors, appropriately, and this is all just anecdotal information that I've heard from people doing these kind of things, but just from observation and common sense as well, if you don't treat those employees or these contractors appropriately, then your workforce is gone, and then how do you sustain that? Oh, but I think if you have enough contract workers, the risk gets kind of spread out. But where do you define that? Do you have enough that the risk is mitigated of potential workforce? But like you were saying, Matt, I think here, in Rochester, even if you're just looking on the level of an individual, there's lots of things you can do to make an extra $100 or $200 a week to, get through some hard times if you're starting a business, between whatever, you have dog walking apps to to Instacart to all these other things. So I think it's positive. At least it gives you, a plan C, D, or E if all these other things fail, or at least that you can pay your rent or mortgage while you're building these things. But just a thought in that perspective.
There's a carryover impact, I think, as folks are maybe motivated to build businesses like Airbnb or like Lyft or somehow tap into the sharing economy. Because sharing is a component of it, I think sometimes entrepreneurs are overlooking the steps that they should be taking to protect and to build that business, and may sometimes fall into the trap of sharing their innovation too early in a way that actually cuts off their ability to generate revenue long term. And I think, obviously, I'm biased as an intellectual property and corporate attorney, that I'm, of course, going to advise clients to look at this carefully. But I think it's especially relevant in a sharing economy, or even, one of the other trends is just social and environmental responsibility. In that space where a company is set up to really help folks or to help society at large, it's easy to get carried away into a movement and lose sight of the very facts that can enable you to actually do great work by building and maintaining a competitive advantage.
Yeah, I think that's true. I wanted to go back to the rapid growth versus sustained growth, and we talk about this pretty much, I'd say, every other time someone brings this up. So it's something that's very pertinent. But I think all of us, working with startups, one of the first things we hear from people is, well, how do I raise money and how do I get a CEO? And I'm like, hold on, do we have a product or what do we have here? So I think it's, a small business or startup I've been involved with, we don't want to get outside funding at this point because we don't know what to do with it, to manage the growth and not have too much too fast. And, I think it's all in personal risk that you're willing to take as well. Some people would rather have more money and just grow as quickly as possible. But I think there's also growing in a strategic manner that makes sense and that's able to be managed and moves towards whatever culture and mission you have. And I think sometimes that's lost when it's just really so rapid growth that you can't even manage all the aspects of it, and then the brand gets diminished too sometimes, in my opinion.
I think that when I think about companies, and maybe this is me from the old man chair, since I'm furniture anyway, just the perspective of, I think everybody thinks they're building a Facebook.
Yeah.
Like when the people I talk to, they're like, I'm big into, something that probably is more fitting as a lifestyle business, or, it could grow, it could be in multiple locations, but it's not Facebook. And they tend to read those stories, and they read Fast Company, and they read all of these magazines and publications. And suddenly they think, well, the only way to raise money is to go talk to a VC. Well, as we all know, that's a small percentage of companies that take VC money, even smaller here in the Midwest.
Is it like 2%, 5%?
I think it bounces between 1.5 and 2 is, I think, what I remember.
And not just a small percentage, but late in the game,
right?
Yeah.
After
a lot of the building has happened, and I think there's a real chicken and egg problem that entrepreneurs face, where in order to get funding, oftentimes they need a pretty well-defined business plan and timeline and specific set of steps that they're working towards, for which they need the funds. And yet many of those steps require the very funds that they're seeking. And so I think many entrepreneurs get stuck in that loop and really need to figure out how to proceed as quickly as possible and as cost-effectively as possible to get those initial market assessments, get the initial product definition on the cheap, so that they actually can get more significant money to really vet out their business case.
I think sometimes too we feel like lifestyle business is a bad word.
Yeah, even just the word entrepreneurship is, we've had this discussion before, is crazy, and it's just, we need better words for this stuff. We haven't been able to come to a consensus on what fits better.
Yeah, I just feel like, like you were saying, you hear a lot of people talk about, oh, we need investment, oh, we need to, have scale our revenue by 2,000% over the next 3 years. And it's like, maybe you don't. Like, is that what you want? Can you do that here? And does that make sense for what you're building? And, lifestyle business is totally appropriate and acceptable, and that's still entrepreneurship.
I think I always like the word small business. You're just creating a small business, and that business may become a medium-sized business, and it may become a large business. You don't know, but I think that's the words I've sort of settled on is you're just a small business owner. And if you're in that sort of that high growth, there's a book by Reid Hoffman called Blitzscaling, and that's one of the books I'm going through now. And sometimes I'm nodding my head yes, sometimes I'm shaking my head no through the whole book. But if you happen to be one of those 1% or 2% that are doing that, then great. And I think there's a different playbook for you. But by and large, I think you've got to really think hard, really think strategically, and of course get a good lawyer when you start out. I had that conversation this morning with someone. A lot of the people that I'm dealing with are extreme or early stage. I mean, they're at the idea stage. And you say, okay, well, you have to think about, how you're going to incorporate. You have to think about who's going to be someone who can give you good legal advice at this stage. It's not going to be the giant corporate lawyers who charge, a corporate rate. It's going to be hopefully people like Matt and people you can just have coffee with and maybe talk a little bit about some stuff. And if that moves into a business deal, then great. Same thing with accountants. And this person was like, when I talked to them about, they're just like, what? I can't spend $100 a session or $100 a month. That's too much. Like, then you're not cut out to do this because
until you have a problem.
You're gonna be spending a heck of a lot more of that than that if you want to grow your business. And so I'm always trying to recommend that you gotta start with the basics. And there's a lot of great people out there who can help you get started. You just have to be willing to put a little bit of skin in the game to get going.
I think that's a great point, and it certainly costs more to fix issues, and in many cases, entrepreneurs may end up giving away their competitive advantage, their intellectual property, or going down a path that gets them into regulatory trouble. And if folks are not willing to spend something early on, this might not be the right path for them. I think you hit on another point, Jamie, that there is a scaled approach that you can take to building a business, and the kind of legal support or accounting support or regulatory support looks very different when you're 2 or 3 or 5 years in than it does when you're batting ideas around in a coffee shop. And as you note, there are many great professionals here in town, here in the state. It's just a matter of finding them and having those conversations. But I think being willing to accept that it's not for the faint of heart to start a business, that there are a lot of challenges that need to be addressed and oftentimes are best addressed earlier rather than later.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of challenges of growing a business, and I think that ties into your last point, Matt, with remote work, different kinds of office spaces and the possibility of remote working. You talk to a lot of people in this community, especially people with tech businesses. It's very hard for them to hire locally a lot, and maybe you don't need to because you can communicate. It's a digital economy. Cameras are fantastic on computers. Internet speeds are fast. So I think that's a challenge here. Growing a small business or a startup is finding that talent and having to reach out into remote workers because maybe perhaps this isn't the most... it can be challenging to get people to want to move to Rochester, we'll put it that way, who aren't from the Midwest and think this is the tundra. That's no surprise to anybody. So... I think that ties into the different office spaces. So teams being more spread out versus the need to all be in one space just out of necessity a lot of the times.
I think the quicker that entrepreneurs can tap into that market, the better off they'll be because oftentimes it is quickest to bring on resources if you're willing to go the remote route. And in my own firm, I've certainly done that. And I've tapped different folks from literally around the globe to help with various aspects that have come up with different parts of forming a firm. And even on the delivery of specialized services like legal services or like accounting services or marketing or building a website. There are so many aspects of building a business that there are resources around the globe, literally. And it is a fact of the new economy, right, that remote work is here to stay. And I think the sooner that entrepreneurs can tap into it in ways that make sense for their business, the better off they'll be.
So I remember call centers. I mean, we all know call centers, right? And in my hometown, there's a giant call center. And so, of course, a lot of the people I graduated from high school with, that's their first job. If they choose not to go to college, they go to the call center. I've often thought about, could you create a remote resource center, sort of along those same lines, and thinking about some of the talent we have in this community that's pretty dormant. Would there be a way to sort of, and you could call it a guild, you don't want to call it a call center, but is there a way to where you can assess people's interests, their talents, and be able to say, okay, now and it could be a company, that now we have all of these services available, and instead of doing it from around the world, which, is granted cheaper, but there are other barriers. You can talk to Nate Nordstrom about, when I met Nate 7 or 8 years ago, I mean, he was farming all his work to India, and it got to be too difficult for him to maintain it, even though it was super cheap. Mm-hmm. So eventually he made that leap into hiring some local people and growing his business. And not to say that people can't do that in those relationships, but I think it took Nate a little bit of time to realize that there was real value in having that human interaction. Now, that was a total tangent from what I was talking about by building a company, but I think there is a lot of talent all over that really I think is underutilized. And I think, not that I want to create the Uber of remote working, but I think there's got to be someone who can sort of find these people, locate them. And there are websites that do similar things. But I don't know. I just think that, if I was offered, I might not go drive an Uber, but if someone said, hey, for $50 an hour, I want you to help me organize my life once a week, or call me in the morning to tell me my 4, meetings for the day, I might actually do that. That would actually appeal to me more than driving someone around in a car at 12:30 at night while they're drunk.
Yeah, no one wants to do that.
But bless the
Someone
people
does,
who
I
do.
guess.
Yes.
Someone does.
Well, you touched on a second aspect to this trend, right? So I talked about the global workforce, but I think the same concepts apply to remote workers here locally. And I think there's an aspect of this trend that is remote relative to a brick and mortar office. And that remote could literally be 2 blocks away from a home office to that same brick and mortar office. But I think there's another aspect to the trend, which is just it's on-demand work and it's freelancing. And certainly that can be done on a local or a global basis. And I think you're right. And I think, I admire the work that you've done over the last number of years in really trying to build that kind of ecosystem around Collider and, this co-working space and building a network. Not as formally as a Facebook, and not something that you're probably taking to IPO, but a network.
To be continued.
Yeah, a network of professionals that certainly I think within the Collider ecosystem, many of us have helped out each other, and more opportunities or more ways that all of us entrepreneurs can do that. I think just benefits each of us and benefits the local economy.
So I think maybe that is a nice transition into this book that I brought to talk about. So
she has a physical prop.
Well, I wanted to make sure that I got everything accurate. So I read this book in a few days. It's a business book, but it reads pretty well. It's called The Culture Code by Daniel Coyle, and it's Secrets of Highly Successful Groups. So basically what he did, he spent years going around to groups that have functioned very well together. To everyone, Navy Team 6, Navy SEALs Team 6 would come to mind. San Antonio Spurs. So those not familiar with sports, based on statistics and predictions they've won more games than they should based on individual players. He talks about the Upright Citizens Brigade. So that's a improv group. So people like Amy Poehler have come out of there. But these groups that work really, really well together, and looking at why they do that. And there was a bit in here in the introduction, which I think was really interesting. So, and you probably heard this before, or some aspect of it. So there was a study with 4-person teams across the world. So there were some in Stanford, some in University of Tokyo, some in the University of California, where they took teams of kindergartners and paired them against teams of business students and law students. They gave them 20 pieces of uncooked spaghetti, a yard of transparent tape, a yard of string, and a marshmallow, and they had to build the tallest structure that they could. And every single time, the kindergartners built structures much taller. They averaged about 26 inches tall. Business students built structures that averaged 10 inches. Lawyers built, sorry, Matt.
They're still in meetings.
They did a little better. They built 15-inch towers, and CEOs built 22-inch towers. So the kindergartners always did better. And the conclusion was because they were working together more as a group and not worried about status of each individual. So they weren't worried about how this person perceived them. They weren't worried about who is the leader. It wasn't based on any leadership skills. It wasn't based on individual intelligence. It was based on group intelligence. And when nobody was trying to lead and nobody was worried about what anyone else was thinking, they were able to perform better. You know, they didn't sit and analyze every piece of spaghetti. They just started building. So anyway, this book was really interesting, and the 3 key components they came up with that were in all of these successful groups where they all were places that felt safe to everybody. So they felt that they could make mistakes. They felt they belonged and there was room for progression for them, or future. They were places where people could share vulnerability, including the quote unquote leaders, and places that had an established purpose that kept being communicated. So, for example, you know, Johnson & Johnson, when they had that big cyanide scare where there was cyanide in the pills, and they were told, even by the FDA, that most of the reports were around the Chicago area. So they said, well, the FDA said, just recall the pills in the Chicago area. But Johnson & Johnson went back to their shared mission, and it was to protect families, nurses, and practitioners. They recalled all of them, all of their pills, and then transitioned into like a safety company. So the, whatever you call it now, the cotton and the pill, you know, the safety tops, they transformed that. So I thought particularly, you know, they were suggesting, and they walked through Walt Disney as well. So in the early, I guess it was about the early 2000s, you know, Walt Disney Animation was performing a little bit poorly. You know, I couldn't even remember any of the movies that they talked about, but there was one with like Roseanne and a bear. Yes. Horrible. And then they acquired Pixar and brought I believe it was the CEO of Pixar in to Walt Disney Animation to try and redo it. And he noticed that all of the groups were on different floors of the building, so he put them all together. And that made a huge difference. Like a few years later, it took a couple years, but a few years later they came out with Frozen, Tangled, you know, these things that really revitalized Walt Disney. So that close communication, or that close physical space, was really important. And there was even some kind of graph in here that said basically over 10 meters of distance, I think it actually was 6. If someone's further than 6 meters away from you, whatever that transfers to into feet, basically your interaction drops off to almost nothing. So like having physical proximity, even if it's just a desk and you don't see the person there, but their stuff is there and you think about them. So I thought it was really interesting, you know, the vulnerability, you know, leaders saying, I don't know, I need help. This is how you can help me. You know, a lot of the times we think you can't show that weakness, but they're actually suggesting that that's needed, and that that close physical interaction is needed as well, where it's not so much someone being in a leadership role, but it's someone actually caring about each individual and being vulnerable and making it feel like a safe space to grow and make mistakes. So it was very interesting. I would recommend it to anybody in an organization, anyone in running a business or in a management role.
So I'm the space guy. So you start talking about space, I get excited. You know, that's really the central tenet of what we tried to do with Collider is I saw a lot of people working in very different worlds really within this city. We weren't really an interconnected city. And so I actually got, my inspiration from Steve Jobs, who ran Pixar for many years, pre-acquisition by Disney. But he designed a building which is now known as the Steve Jobs Building, and he purposefully designed it so that you were forced to have these random collisions. The bathrooms were all kind of in this strange place where you had to walk through these atriums. That 6 foot thing, or 6 yard, no, 6 meter. I'm going metric.
That's not very far.
It's a little bit of a way, but so even halls were designed to sort of limit that. So you're at least ships passing in the night, people running into each other, and that's sparking conversations and crazy ideas that might turn into something big. And that was my thought, is what if you put these people who are all doing that in a space? I had a much loftier, broader idea of it, incorporating a lot of different things from prototyping to wet lab space to office space, and having this giant place where people from all these disciplines were running into each other all the time. But I just actually came back half an hour ago from One Discovery Square. And I've been going around and sort of showing people around, because it's open really to the public, but no one actually goes in there because they're waiting for some sign that says open or whatever. Right. And it always looks like there's nothing going on or whatever, but it's open now. People are in there, and actually UMR students are the ones that are coming in and out. You're seeing about 100 of them flow in. When I was there, I was like, where are all these kids coming from?
They exist.
But the cool thing is I've kind of been the creepy lurker guy in the corner during events like happy hours that they hold and breakfasts. And I am seeing, and I think this is a momentously big change for our community, is I'm seeing Mayo Clinic people stopping and actually interacting with other people in the community, whether they're students, they're from companies like Epic who have space there, or they're just people from the community who are there, from local artists who are evaluating a space for some artwork that they would like to put up. But it's all based on this. They call it Collaboration Hall. I think that sounds vaguely communistic. So whoever named that, I'm sorry, but he could have come up with a better name. But it is a great way to kind of get people to run into each other.
You have to go through there, right?
You don't have to, but most people will. That's kind of the entrance that's the most known. But next Wednesday, you'll see a soft opening of Cafe Steam. They'll be serving waffles. I just checked out the waffle iron. It's awesome. So you're just going to see all of these people meshing together, and that was always the dream, is putting people in a space where they get to know each other, they share ideas, and I'm really excited to see what comes out of that. So I think close physical proximity is really key to, at least from an ecosystem perspective, from a community perspective. I think that's something that is just so vital that I will toot Rochester's horn. I think they're ahead of the curve on this one.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean that takes us sort of in the opposite direction of one of these other trends that we were talking about just earlier about remote workers, on-demand workers, and freelancers. And I agree that there's a growing vibrancy here, and I wonder if we entrepreneurs wouldn't benefit from tackling or tapping into really both of those spaces to start with, and to engage in that human face-to-face interaction wherever possible, but then not shy away from the on-demand and remote work access that we have on a growing basis in this global economy. I think, Amanda, you touched on another point that I find interesting, just given my corporate background, and that is the safe culture. And I think especially in the context of entrepreneurs, I think there's an aspect of that that relates to risk tolerance. And I think as entrepreneurs, we have to be willing to take risks, and we have to be willing to let our teams take risks. And I think there's a related point that a safe culture means providing your team with the right boundaries so that they don't go too far off the rails, but somehow incentivizing the risk-taking that actually leads to growth. And the unstated point there is that some of that risk taking is not going to work out.
Right.
You're going to spend money, you're going to fail.
Most of it won't work.
And your team has to sort of know their boundaries, and they have to be not just allowed to do that, but affirmed in meaningful, thoughtful, risk-taking activity. And that's not always celebrated, shall we say, in larger environments, but I think it's absolutely key to the entrepreneurial ecosystem.
Yeah, for example, with Pixar, they do those little, I guess it's probably like 2-minute shorts in front of movies. I don't know if they do that anymore because I really don't go to the movies anymore, but that actually they said that lost them money. So as a whole, it would seem like a horrible business idea, but it allowed them to test new talent and test new ideas to see what people wanted or liked and resonated with them. But yeah, I agree. It's the, pushing yourself to the limits and knowing that if you fail or when a perceived failure occurs, that everything doesn't end and you don't diminish in whatever, I don't know what you would call it, but diminish in view of your coworkers or your colleagues, like the kindergartners. They didn't care. If anything, they didn't care what anyone else thought about them. They were just going to build the spaghetti tower. So it's that thought of, that social interaction is just, just a natural and unbiased and, that everyone can contribute equally.
The kindergarten point is interesting to me from a different aspect. I don't have the stat, the precise stat at my fingertips, but it's pretty well established that the biggest drop in human creativity happens from slightly before kindergarten stage or right around that stage to, I think it's about 7 or 8. And it just absolutely plummets. And I wonder if there's a lesson there that we should be more creative and think more out of the box, like a kindergarten, or before we learn all of these constraints on our thinking.
Yeah. So I guess if this is true and that the proximity really is necessary for collaboration, how do you reconcile that with the remote working? Because I agree. I think it's completely necessary. And I think there are ways it could be managed, but it would just be it's obviously more difficult, I think, and I see a lot of people here doing it, the video or the videos on whatever, Skype or Zoom or whatever. I think that's immensely more meaningful than a phone call because you can actually see the person and just having that really at your fingertips.
My favorite thing is, and I've done this, I'll admit I'm guilty. I love the video because people can see you. Mm-hmm. And so there's a certain level of professionalism, of accountability. I've been in many a phone conversation where, people are rolling their eyes at things and just, banging their head against the table.
You can see them.
And muting things and having conversations around it. And that just, I don't know, culturally, I don't think that's a great way to go. So I do see almost everyone here, they're not at Collider, they're not engaged in a lot of phone conversations.
No.
It's usually, if they're remote working, it's using Zoom or using Google Hangouts. And I think that does, that's an example of where technology can sort of provide a window into someone else's world. So maybe they are 6 meters, even though they're thousands of miles apart. So that's been really good, and that's a trend I've seen just in the last few years here. As a lot of people started out on the phone, and now it's almost 100% video discussions, even when it doesn't need to be. I mean, we have Slack gurus here who can do hashtag whatever, and it immediately does a video chat to someone else immediately, and they're having a conversation. And I've heard this conversation. It's like, well, what do you think about this? Well, I think, let's try this, and this. Okay, good. See you. Bye. That it's something probably that most of us would handle over the phone. Mm-hmm. It's second nature to just pop up a window, have a quick discussion, shut it down, and then go back to chat world again.
Yeah. I think Slack has been really good, even if we're talking about people in the same room, like people here. You won't necessarily, you might not go over and talk to somebody, but I think, you can do little funny images and stuff and everyone laughs about it and, people ask if people want pizza or something. So
that's been especially good for me.
That's been happening a lot. But I think maybe that could be where technology comes in and makes a little, even in a space where people are in the same, however big this is, 1,000 square foot space, that helps break down those barriers a little bit. So I don't know, just a thought, because it's a little more, you can show a little bit more personality on there, and it is like second nature that you just pop up the button and talk to someone real fast, or you just type something away and put a little whatever emoji or whatever dancing parrot on it or something, and then I don't know, a little bit better communication than a text or a phone call.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we talk about, distractions and things during audio, I've been vigorously looking at my phone, but I was doing it because I was trying to think of the name of a book, and touching on this earlier concept of losing your creativity at a certain age. So 2 books that have really helped me sort of gain that back. The first is Creative Confidence by Tom Kelly. That's a great book. Tom Kelly is one of the founders of IDEO. And actually had a hand, if people are familiar here in Rochester with the Center for Innovation, Tom was one of the people who initially consulted on the idea of a Center for Innovation. Wonderful speaker, great guy. But that's about recapturing that creativity and bringing it into groups and kind of starting to think with your kindergarten brain again. And what that's led to in companies like IDEO as they work to create products for people all over the world. The other one, going back to, this is the Pixar episode, is Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull. That is just a wonderful guide for exactly the strategy that Pixar uses, from what they call their brain trust meetings, which are really cool, the design of their spaces and all of that. It's just a really excellent study in how to inspire a lot more creativity in people. And I've seen this time and time again. Once people start to get creative, that's when things really work for startups. They work for as much as we can try in large corporations. But I've always found that the coolest people in my mind, and the people that were really driving things forward, were the most creative. And they've always been great sources of inspiration for me.
In my mind, that takes us right back to the safe culture, because I think the creative folks are also the folks who are taking risks, and they're working outside of the established norms, and I think that's an important element. And in order for them to be successful, almost inherently, they are working within a safe environment where they have the freedom to go outside of those established norms.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're nearing the end, so I'll ask you both for any final thoughts, and then where people how people can get in touch with you best.
Final thoughts. I don't know. We've talked about a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah.
I got nothing. You can edit that one out.
Yeah.
We have covered a lot of ground, and some of the points that we've talked about really cut in different directions. But I think a theme that I've heard is just a human element, both in physical proximity and in communication. And there's lots of different ways we can communicate, but I think introducing a more human element certainly can make our teams more dynamic. Great environment here in Rochester and in Minnesota, and it's certainly great to be a part of it, and appreciate the chance to be on the podcast today. In terms of contacting me, folks can reach me at matthew.smyth, that's SMYTH, at headlandlaw.com.
And if you want to check out some of the things we've talked about in reality, we are practicing collaborators and creatives here at Collider Coworking. So check us out at collider.mn, and you can always shoot me an email at hello@collider.mn to talk about anything really related to the entrepreneurial ecosystem of Rochester.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much to Matt and Jamie for sharing their thoughts and joining in on this conversation today. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can find many more and more stories of entrepreneurship and innovation at our website at www.rochesterrising.org. You can also find us via our newsletter, so you can sign up for it right on our homepage, and that will let you know when each podcast comes out each week. We're also on Facebook, on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, so you can check us out on any of those platforms. And if you have a great Rochester-based entrepreneur who would be an amazing guest for the podcast, let us know. Send us an email at rochesterrising@gmail.com, letting us know why they would be a great guest and have a story that needs to be told. That's a wrap for the podcast today. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen in to your audio content so that you never miss a story of entrepreneurship and innovation coming out of Rochester, Minnesota. We'll be back again next week with a brand new episode.